welcome everyone. I'm Jeevan Vasaga, I'm climate editor at Tortoise. Welcome to this ThinkIn on plastic, a substance that we have a love-hate relationship with. We're here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Welcome to everyone who's in the room. Welcome to everyone online. We're going to think for about 45 minutes about the usefulness of plastic as a technology and how we deal with its negative side effects and how we can reconcile the two. Before we start, I'd like to say thank you to the New York Times who are hosting us, and thank you also to Dow who are co-curating this session with us. I'm going to start by going to Steve Fletcher, who's joining us online. Steve is director of the Global Plastics Policy Center, and he's an expert at the University of Portsmouth. Steve. Could I ask you first to give us some sense of the scale of the problem, Steve? So we know that there's as we saw from the opening slides, we know there's a huge waste management problem when it comes to plastic, and this is particularly so in developing countries. Can you just give us some idea of the sort of negative side effect that we're dealing with from plastics?
Yeah, thank you, Javine, and hello to everybody else in the room and online. Yeah, plastic pollution in Africa is entirely endemic. You can't really go anywhere without seeing very significant plastic pollution. It's particularly endemic in urban settings where people live in extremely polluted urban areas. There, the plastic is used for fuel, which creates health implications from ingestion and breathing the plastics in as they're being burned. Of course, the plastic leaks into nature, into the environment in various ways, into river channels, into the sea. We're looking at plastic leakage or pollution tripling by 2040, and the current policy framework that is in place to reduce plastic pollution is, I think it's fair to say, wholly mismatched to the scale of the problem. The current commitments from both government and industry are expected only to reduce the increase of plastic pollution by 7%. So that's a real challenge, I think. There's a mismatch between the public perception of the challenge of plastic pollution, which is treats the plastic pollution problem very seriously, but the policy response is relatively weak in comparison.
Absolutely, yeah, it's interesting to me that of all the environmental problems we're dealing with, plastic is the one that perhaps has cut through to the public most obviously. Steve, thank you very much for starting us off there. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes to talk about some of the solutions and some of the principles for change. But first, Nishara Siabani, I'd like to come to you. We're going to talk a bit more about the problem in a moment, but first, can you give us the case for plastics?
So the case for plastics. So I think Africa without plastics is unrealistic. Plastic has its place. It serves a good purpose, and we believe that we should use the right packaging for the right products. Of course, we do not. Where we believe that we can improve is on the waste management. So we want to see at the end of life.
Before we get to the solutions, let's talk about what plastic is used for. So there's obviously, and particularly, the experience we've all just had with the pandemic, we've seen a broad range of uses of plastic for medical purposes, which probably very few people here in the room or online would disagree with. But I think there's more contention about some of the other uses of plastic. So what's plastic sort of mainly used for, would you say, in the developing world?
Of course, plastics is used for food preservation. Let me give you an example. A cucumber, which is unwrapped by plastic, can last up to 5 days. If it is wrapped in plastic, it can last to 14 days. Right. So food waste in itself is such a huge challenge. It allows product where a lot of the countries do not have, for example, electricity or means for refrigeration. So it allows for food preservation. It allows for clean water to be carried around accessibly in countries such as Nigeria, where they use a lot of the water pouches to have accessible drinking water wherever they go. It's used for making sure that we don't use as much flavorants or additives in foods as well.
Right.
So definitely in food, 100%, and also with clean drinking water. And so that's
Thank you, Nishara. Okay, we'll come back to you in a moment to talk a bit more about solutions. I have to say, though, there's nothing that makes me crazier than a cucumber wrapped in plastic. And I think that's true of a lot of people. But now I know why it's
now
wrapped
you know
up.
Why.
Okay, that's helpful. Abby, let me come to you. So one thing I want to kind of get into early in this conversation is whether there's agreement on the uses of plastic. So does your heart leap when you see a cucumber wrapped in plastic?
I would like to point out that there is a solution for that. So in Korea, there's this thing called the kimchi. So
Okay.
there's a lot of ways that has been done for the past for the past century.
Yeah.
And it's always going back to the basic. How did they do it? It was definitely much more inconvenient, but it can be done.
Right. So if we're going to think about what plastic is used for and how we deal with the plastic waste problem, is the beginning of it really thinking about which uses are essential and trying to find agreement on that?
Definitely.
I mean, who's having that conversation? How would you begin to have that conversation, do you think?
I'm actually not so sure. We're
Right.
actually still exploring right now, and a lot of people have different perspectives, but there's no one answer to this actually.
Yeah. Josh, I saw you look over as we talked about plastic water pouches.
Yeah.
Well, I come from Ghana, not so different from Nigeria with this problem. And I've been a big advocate against the thinking that we need these plastic pouches to get water to everybody.
Right.
Of course, it is to some extent convenient, but it's a very privatized approach of making water available to people. Let's not forget that what people need is access to water.
Yeah.
And the water is available.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we get it to them? Well, how do we get water to everybody? Is through water, the national water company flowing it through the pipelines. You turn your tap on, you get water.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, it can be done. But the private sector has really been tough on selling the idea of water pouches as pure water. And I'll give you a bit of history to this. So in Ghana, Nigeria, the whole West Africa region, this is how it came. It came as pure water. People used to go to the stream and they were getting relatively decent water that they could drink. There were ways of boiling water, letting it cool, having a filter at home, and you use it.
Yeah.
But then the excessive marketing of private sector told them that no, water in pouches is pure water. So now we all have to move towards that direction and drink pure water.
Yeah.
Right? So that marketing starts, and it influences our thinking that this is the only way to get water to drink. So now, even if clean water flows through the tap, that thinking is sealed in your mind that
Right.
pure water is what is in the plastic pouches.
Yeah.
And that's what you need to drink.
Yeah.
So we need to reverse that, reduce the unnecessary excessive marketing around pure water, and get water flowing through the taps, get into the homes of people, install filters at home. People can get water at home without the need of, and to be honest, in Accra, in Nigeria, Lagos are the big cities, and I agree with Steve that the urban centers are the most heavy on plastics.
Yeah.
The majority of that are takeaway packages, styrofoam, and water pouches.
Yeah.
That is majority of it. So
Part of this is to do with rapid urbanization, right? So you've got a big shift from the country to the city, and infrastructure perhaps hasn't been able to keep pace. And obviously there are sort of big scale answers to these problems. But actually, just give us a bit more context on your organization. So you're an NGO and chiefly involved in supporting community efforts with waste management. Is that right? Just
Yes.
tell us a bit more about that.
So our work mainly is working with communities, municipalities,
Yeah.
waste management stakeholders to
Yeah.
find the best way to reduce waste to the very barest minimum.
Yeah.
And whatever residual waste we have left, how do we put that into the circular economy concept and use that for something that is productive, that it doesn't bring harm to the environment?
Yeah.
And a quick thing I will say, which I'm very proud of, is that we've been talking to our ministry for many years around this plastic water pouch problem. And now we get into the phase where we are happy to pilot on a public scale. How do we get water dispensers? How do we get people to access water by tapping it? Water flows. You trust that the water is clean. We communicate the data. We communicate that this is clean water. It's not just water in pouches that they can have access to. But believe me, it's still very difficult because the marketing has gone on for decades. I mean, it's been almost 2 to 3 decades since pure water came into our country. So
Yeah.
it's been long. People really believe that, but they also see the amount of waste that is there. And I think that once we reduce the marketing and shift it towards that, you have clean water flowing through your taps, you have clean water dispensers around the city, you can have access to it. You don't need to pay 30 pesos or whatever money to get access to water that is in pouches. That will change the mindset. The second thing which I'll briefly talk about is we have not really emphasized the impact of the plastic that actually holds the water
Yeah.
from the health perspective.
Right.
Many research that have been done in Ghana shows that once these water powders are left in the sun over days of storage before they actually go to market, there's a lot of leaches that go from the plastic itself into the water that people drink.
Right.
And it leads to a lot of health implications. But again, the private sector have been very tough on the market in that still this is pure water.
Yeah.
And people trust that. So while, of course, it increases accessibility, we need to acknowledge that it's still very problematic for the consumers. They are not drinking pure water. They are drinking toxic water.
Yeah.
And that is the plain truth.
Okay, I just want to zoom out for a minute. We've talked and you've given us kind of great insight into the impact on the ground in parts of Africa, but plastic is also a sort of global problem and probably needs to be thought about in a global context. And Abby, when we were talking earlier, I was really struck by what you told me about how you got into doing what you're doing. So this was triggered by seeing something on a beach, right? Tell us about that.
It wasn't seeing something
on a beach.
Not
on a beach, sorry.
Where were you? Seeing a Sainsbury plastic bag flying around my hometown.
Okay.
Sainsbury is not in Asia at all.
And your hometown is?
Is back in Perak, Malaysia. Yeah.
Right.
So it was a eye-opening effect for me, and that's when I started to go all out because I thought it was just my neighbor's trash, but it was quite consistent, and there was a trail for it, and that's how we started doing this. And one other thing I would like to add on what Josh was saying is that this is a very common issue where the plastic packaging itself has a really incredibly bad effect on us Malaysians too. So I had the privilege to study in the UK, and a lot of my friends, when they go to the UK has drinking water. You can drink by tap, you can drink through tap, but they still wouldn't drink from tap. They would bring, I have a friend that actually shipped plastic water bottles from Malaysia all the way to UK just to get water. It's a mentality that, like what he said, it's just branding, marketing, a lot of consumerism.
So part of this is a problem of consumer perceptions and how consumers think about goods and how fresh they are. But there is also growing consumer awareness, isn't there, of the problem of too much plastic. So I mean this cuts both ways, doesn't it? Nishar, can I come to you on this? So if we're thinking about consumer behaviour as part of the answer to the problem, what are the kind of messages? What is the kind of conversation that you want to have with people about plastic usage and when plastic should be used and what kind of plastic we should be using?
Sure, and I think plastic should be used when it is the right packaging for use. If we look at other types of packaging that can be used, we have to look at the other issue that comes into place because we are looking at decarbonization as well. And plastic has a very low carbon footprint in order to produce it as compared to some of its alternatives as well. So plastics, yes, has a problem when it comes to the recycling. But if you look at some of the alternatives, if you look at how it's produced, then yes, of course, there is some issues as well. I think, when we look at Africa as a whole in terms of the issues that we face is you cannot, you have to sort, waste management is definitely a crucial issue.
Right.
It's something that cannot be ignored. And we have to have the infrastructure in order to do that. So it is a solution, but it cannot be what it looks like for the West or for Europe, for example. It has to look specifically for what is in Africa. And Africa is so localized. I mean, from Ghana to Nigeria to South Africa, where I live, to Kenya, everything looks completely different. So we cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution. And I do believe that, we cannot address this problem alone either. We have to collaborate. So whereas Europe relies on municipal contracts, we have to rely on the local waste pickers, so the waste entrepreneurs as such. Dow has just announced that we have partnered with a recycling company, Mr. Green Africa, who addresses this issue. He's the first Series B company in Africa who is very much into social justice and into a fair plastic waste trade.
Great. So let me just scroll back and say, before we get into kind of waste management and recycling of plastic, there's also a responsibility on manufacturers and on producers of plastic. So let's talk about that for a moment. What would you say is your responsibility as the producer of the feedstock, and what's your relationship like with plastic manufacturers? What pressures are you able to put on them, or what incentives are you able to give them for better practice?
Of course, Dow has our own sustainability goals. We want to be carbon neutral by 2050. By 2030, we want to reduce our carbon emissions by 15%. We also want to transform the waste. So we do not just want to make sure that we have the end of plastic waste, but we want to create a circular economy where we transform waste to worth. We also want to close the loop where all the products that we sell into are 100% recyclable by 2035.
Right. I'd like to come back to Steve, if we can bring him back, and just think about what principles we have for designing a more effective economy. Steve, hi. So you've heard a bit from Nishara and from Josh and Abby on the problem, but if we focus for a minute on manufacturers and the makers of plastic feedstock, what's the sort of starting point for them, would you say? What sort of principles should they be thinking about from the beginning in terms of producing less waste?
Yeah, thanks, Javine. If I could just make a couple of comments on what I've heard so far. I think you typically hear, particularly from the plastics industry, that the problem is, or the solution, sorry, is downstream. So in the recycling part of the plastics economy, and really the solution needs to begin upstream, which I come to in a moment, at the production stage. You also hear a lot of emphasis on citizen behaviour as part of the solution, and citizens being pressured or sometimes blamed for making, let's say, wrong or inappropriate choices. But the reality is often they have no choice, and the economy in which they operate, in which we all exist, actually, doesn't provide the choices that we need to make better choices to have more sustainable solutions. So I think we need to be careful about claims like that. To answer your question specifically, I'd say in order to transition to a more sustainable plastics economy, there are three things that we need. One is to reduce plastics entering the economy in the first place. The more that plastics that enter the economy, the more pollution we end up with, the more devastation to biodiversity, the more blight to people's lives that we experience. Also, the vast majority of the carbon emissions from the plastic life cycle comes at the production and extraction stages of the life cycle. So it has a huge carbon saving, greenhouse gas saving, by reducing plastics entering the economy. And we can do that through things like banning plastics that we know we can't reuse or recycle, banning plastics that are toxic or have toxic additives, plastics that can't be collected or separated properly, that sort of thing. We can also try and give plastic its true value. I mean, at the moment, none of the costs of plastic are really costed into the price of making the plastic in the first place. So none of the environmental costs.
How effective are bans, Steve, at shaping behaviour? I mean, a lot of countries have now introduced plastic bag bans. Is that a useful tool for driving change?
Sure. I think the jury's out, to be honest, Javine. I think it depends on how rigorously the bans are enforced. The second point is that a lot of the challenges in the plastics economy right now from mismatched policies in different countries. So if you have a very strict ban on a particular plastic product in one place, the market will just move somewhere else to get around that ban. So what we really need is an internationally coherent approach to dealing with plastics. I mean, bans have their place, but to my mind, really what we need is this reduction of plastics entering the economy. And the second point I was about to make, if I may, Javine, is then the plastics that are useful and that are in the economy, we just keep circulating those as long as possible. And that is through reuse, refill, and good recycling. But recycling in itself isn't the solution. It's really reusing the useful and, let's call them, good plastics, so useful plastics, plastics for the purposes that we've just been hearing about, food and health and so on. I think no one debates the value of those. So let's keep them in the economy as long as possible so that we're not creating waste and driving that linear approach to creating more plastic in the first place.
Steve, Nishara, could you just give us a commercial perspective on what we've just heard? I think it seems obvious to me that recycling plastic will be better than using virgin plastic, encouraging manufacturers to use less plastic and more recyclables in what they use, and making their goods more recyclable seems to make sense. What are the barriers to doing that? How difficult is that in practice?
So, I think just to take one step back, with with what we are doing in terms of making sure that there's less plastic or more recyclable plastic available in the market, we have designed for recyclability. So we make sure that our virgin resins that go out are designed to be recycled. We are also sourcing bio-based fuels. Our feedstocks are being sourced as bio-based. And we also do what we call mechanical recycling, which is the creation of post-consumer recyclate, which is the PCR material, which then can be mixed with virgin resin to create a more recycled packaging. The payoffs of using PCR in your packaging is that it's not as attractive, it's not as shiny, you don't use as much laminates in it, as much coloring in it. So the punchline that we use is gray is the new green. So we have to change consumer behavior so that they accept packaging that is not as necessarily attractive, but is definitely more recyclable.
Right. And how do you incentivize your partners to do these things that you're describing?
Right. So we work with infrastructure and, of course, the ground roots. So we partner with recycling companies, and we incentivize. So we pay the waste pickers get a premium for picking up flexible plastics. So let me explain the problem. When you collect flexible plastics, you have to work 10 times as hard as if you were collecting a rigid or hard plastic, because you have to bend down 10 times. It doesn't weigh a lot. So of course, it's not necessarily the ones that are easily picked up. So by incentivizing the collection of flexible waste, we are then able to make sure that it gets removed from the environment. We then help create a PCR, which is a post-consumer recyclate. And then we work with brand owners to create a higher value product at the end of the day to drive this whole process. Because of course it has to be commercially viable as well, because we have to make sure that the circle works. And it is a circular economy. So we have project reflexes across Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, where we are focusing 100% on the collection and the repurposing of flexible plastic waste in these regions. So again, in each of these countries, they look different. In Guinea, we are collecting flexible plastic waste, and we're turning them into water containers and flower pots. In Nigeria, we're taking the much debated water pouches and converting them into packaging for detergents.
Abby, can I bring you in at this point, because obviously your focus has been on repurposing plastic. So what are the kind of uses that repurposed plastic is being put to by your organization? Just give us a bit of context on that.
Sorry, just about my organization?
About what you do, yeah.
So what Purpose Plastic is doing is we are repurposing plastic that cannot be recycled anymore, that is contaminated. So it's an easier repurposing process, not a chemical recycling process. So all we have to do is just clean it, crush it, and then mix it with other aggregation. So it's much easier to convert it into a longer lasting plastic use, converting single-use plastic into a longer lasting plastic use.
Where do solutions like that fit in, do you think, in terms of dealing with the plastic challenge? So, I mean, I think that what we've heard from Steve is a suggestion that simply reducing the overall amount of plastic coming into the system is a critical first step. And then thinking about recycling through the process and building recycling infrastructure is an important part of it. How much of a part do you think that repurposing plays, and how much public awareness is there in Malaysia of the need to repurpose?
Repurposing plastic is at the front line, actually, because a lot of times people think that to establish a recycling plant, it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of time, money, and etc. But to do what we're doing, you can set it up in 2 days. All you have to do is just start collecting plastic from everywhere. It doesn't matter what sort of plastic. We wouldn't. There's no requirement that we only need HDP or PP. It's all sorts, and we just separate it by colors actually. So it's from, in a way, a creative point of view, what we could do with existing plastic waste that is just sitting on the floors, on the grounds of our communities. So it's encouraging people from, it's not only happening in Malaysia. We also have 2 NGOs that are in process of setting up their own Purpose Plastic Hub. So this is easily expandable. We could do this anywhere, and we are not stingy with how we're doing it. We're happy to share.
Sure. And Josh, you spoke a bit about waste collection infrastructure in countries that you've operated in. What are the difficulties of getting that waste collection off the ground? And is it largely in sort of private hands? Are we talking about basically individuals who are waste picking for profit rather than municipal waste collection?
So there are two parts of it. You have municipalities who will contract a formal company to do collection, which is what is standard everywhere. And we like to think it works. It doesn't work. What happens is then you have individual waste workers who start picking waste and selling it to private companies. They become big. At some point, we try to work with them to formalize them. They have a better purchasing power. They have agreements with buyers. And that is all sort of informal aside from the municipalities' work.
Yeah.
Right? During pandemic, what we saw was that these informal sector doesn't have contracts. So they cannot even get subsidies. They cannot get any benefits from government. They are not registered. So any sort of relief plan that is set in place, they will not benefit from it. Right? Which is really bad. So most of my work with communities in these situations is getting municipalities to recognize the work of the informal waste workers, work together with them, acknowledge that this is how much role they play in getting waste off their city, and giving them that financial support that they can be able to do the work that they do. This includes PPEs, this includes health insurances, this includes some sort of identification, that we can also restore dignity to the work that they do, which is a very important part that we most often forget. No, I've had waste pickers who come back to us and they went to pick waste, they were insulted, they were spat upon, they were whatever. You know, these are it's sort of an ugly, filthy business, but without them, no city in the sub-Saharan African continent will look better, right? So their work is so important. I think that what we have forgotten, even in the plastics treaty and this conversation today, is we're talking so much about what we are going to do, right? So we need to do this, we need to do that, but let's not forget the waste that is already there. And this is the same mistake that the climate agenda did. We talk so much about reducing emissions, without focusing on the emissions that are already up there. So even if we stop emissions today, we still have a consequence and we still have something that we're going to have to resolve. So the same with the plastics. The treaty should guide us towards how do we stop the incoming plastic, but how do we also deal with the plastics that are already there? And we will need multiple approaches to resolve that.
We're touching on the role of government in your answer. Why is it that you would say that municipalities are not motivated to organize this themselves? Why is it that it's falling into private hands?
Look, I'll be honest with you, the capacity is low.
Okay.
I've worked with municipalities. I work in a municipality myself. There's no joke having to deal with individual waste pickers spurring up every morning from different directions. You know, it's just not easy. So there has to be some sort of resource infrastructure that allows them to effectively work with these informal waste workers who have a better chance of collecting more waste. And I think this is where civil society plays an important role. So together, like my organization, many other organizations I know, coming together, being able to offer that helping hand of mobilizing informal waste workers, right? Identifying them. How many are you exist, right? How do you operate? Which areas do you collect the waste from? Where do you take the waste to? How do you process your waste? Who are you selling to? What is the market rate? And sort of regulating all of that makes it way easier for municipalities to then bring them on board and engage them. But to leave it all alone to municipalities, I think, to be fair, it's not that simple.
Can we bring Tommy into the conversation?
Joshua covered some of the points that I made in the chat. It's this idea of increasing the value of waste management for the average person. And I mentioned, again, as Joshua covered, the need to formalize the waste management system. You have a lot of people just picking up rubbish and hoping to trade it for money, but not really with the environment in mind. And I think a major hurdle that I feel is the lack of priority that the government gives that area. Nigeria, I can only really speak for Nigeria, but Nigeria is one of the richest nations in Africa. It is the richest nation in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And yet they don't have some of the structures that they need to be on the front foot when it comes to dealing with the problems that they cause, if that makes sense. I think that they need to prioritize it, and then that will funnel down to the municipality level in terms of dealing with the amount of waste that just gets dumped into the sea, dumped into the rivers, dumped into the open sewers, dumped onto the streets. It is a really big problem, but also the public don't realize that it's a massive problem. And I think that was the point that I was trying to make.
Great point, and a really kind of like it touches on the previous point that the people perhaps making profits out of this process don't sort of bear the ultimate cost. That's being borne by the people living with plastic littering their streets. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you. Having heard that, I guess Nishara, can I come back to you on this and say, is there an expanded role for the private sector to play here? If there's, as Josh has pointed out, a lack of government capacity, do you think this might rest more than manufacturers to take more responsibility for their products further downstream?
So I think, you have to see policy, so the environmental needs and the consumer needs. And if you see them as two different things, you'll never actually get a good answer, but you have to see them as working together. Mm-hmm. It's an educational problem as much as it is an investment priority. Mm-hmm. So yes, the government has to play their part, but private sector also has to play their part as well. So I think, this problem is quite big to tackle on its own. A lot of players need to come together. Collaboration is key. But we have seen in Africa over the past few years the establishment of extended producer responsibilities. In mm-hmm. South Africa, it's just been legislated now in January, mm-hmm. Where it puts some of the responsibility on the producers. And we've seen organizations like KEPRO in Kenya come up as well, where it's the Kenyan Extended Producer Responsibility Act, where a lot of the organizations are now working to actually make sure that everyone involved in producing the plastics, in generating the plastics, and using the plastics all come together to sort this problem out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And if we're thinking more about kind of what government does, is there a bigger role for government to play in terms of
regulating?
In terms of regulating this? I mean, what would you like to see done? Steve talked about bans earlier and felt that pushed the problem elsewhere. But what would good government regulation look like?
So bans are very attractive, but I don't believe that that's necessarily the solution. Mm-hmm. More than 30 African countries have partial or full bans on plastics.
Right. Some of the most widespread anywhere in the world.
And it still has not necessarily sorted the problem out. Yeah. I think what we need is a circular economy. Mm-hmm. And once we have plastic that goes into the system and that is collected and reused again and again and again and repurposed, then everyone wins.
Right. I'd like to bring Steve back in at this point, if I can, and just come back to the question of the circular economy and what the design principle of that would look like. Steve, we've come to the sort of point of thinking about solutions and what the principles are for solving this. What do you think the basic design principles that we're talking about look like, and who should mandate those? Whose responsibility is it?
Well, the basic design principles for a circular economy are both the responsibility of government to set the rules, if I could put it like that, and the private sector to work within those rules and guidelines. And I think there are a number of key design principles, I suppose. One would be that the materials used in plastic products and the design of the products themselves are such that the materials and products can either be reused or refilled in some way, creating a reduction in demand for new plastic products, or that they're designed in such a way that they are less likely to end up as pollution and more suitable for recycling if necessary. Reuse is the preferred approach, but if necessary, recycling would be the next step. But at the moment, what we have is a system that designs products and materials that can't often be reused and can't often be recycled. And that's not an issue of public education, as was previously said a minute ago. That's an issue of private sector choosing to design products in a certain way that continues the demand for those products and those materials. So the transition to a plastics economy clearly has to be a partnership between the public and private sector, but there has to be extreme clarity about what we're trying to generate, and it's a system that reuses the plastic within the economy as much as possible to both limit pollution, so plastic dropping out of that economy, and to reduce the demand for new and virgin plastics entering the economy in the first place. And that is a design choice, essentially.
What role does substitution play? So is there a place for paper or card or other wrapping materials? Or do we simply need to be thinking about using less?
Yes, there's absolutely a role for alternative materials, not just the materials you said, but a whole variety of materials, particularly metals and other things. What we need to look at is not just the life cycle analysis of the production of those materials, but over the course of a number of years. I mean, think how long an aluminium bottle could be used for in the economy, even though it maybe has greater climate impacts in its production. But if we then use it for 40 years, then the net benefit is significant over plastic products. So we have to look realistically across the entire life cycle and include downstream impacts on people's lives, on nature, on the economy, on other forms of environmental risk. All these things are not costed in to plastics at the moment. So plastics look very attractive in these sorts of economic analyses, but the reality is that they cost an absolute fortune across the entire life cycle of their use.
Is that including these costs in the price, basically?
Yeah, I mean that would be ideal. At the moment, the plastics industry benefits from a huge sort of subsidy or implicit subsidy around the production of fossil fuels, and secondly, because the industry doesn't have to take account of the costs that are downstream, like the impacts of nature, impacts on the climate, impacts on people's lives, health and well-being. None of those costs are included in the price of virgin plastic.
Okay. And just a final question to you, Steve, like thinking about this from a global perspective, a lot of plastic use in the West is predicated on that plastics being exported to parts of the developing world where it's then meant to be recycled. I think there's growing awareness that recycling isn't working. And China, as we know, is now reluctant to take in other countries' waste. What's the end point of this? I mean, do you think the plastic recycling, this model of kind of global plastic recycling, is going to become impossible?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, Javine. And some people believe very strongly that export of plastic waste is appropriate to countries that can deal with it and have the right facilities to deal with it, and doesn't displace their own capacity to deal with their own waste. The counter argument is there's also a moral argument, really, that countries should really deal with the waste they generate themselves. And interestingly, a group of MPs only this week in the United Kingdom have suggested that the UK should cease all export of the UK plastic waste for that reason.
Right. Abby, can I come to you on this? Because Malaysia, as we know, is a country that has taken in plastic waste from other parts of the world to process. Mm-hmm. What's your view on whether this is a viable model, really, of dealing with the plastic waste problem?
It's simple. How do they make sure it's being recycled? It's a different country. It's a different jurisdiction. Yeah. How do they make sure it's actually recycled? So there's actually a lot of loopholes going on. It's a huge black market. You're getting tax rebate from UK, tax rebate from Malaysia itself, mm-hmm. and you get incentives because you're doing a recycling initiative, but actually it's just sitting on the landfill. How do people make sure that it's actually being recycled? And that's the tricky question. And also coming to a corporate point of view, I do understand there's good corporate companies and there's bad ones, irresponsible ones as well. Mm-hmm. One thing we have to actually focus on is the irresponsible plastic production that is going on a lot on food packaging. When we talk about additives in plastic, when we talk about the labeling in each plastic packaging, it's not that common anymore compared to 10 years ago, when a lot of emphasis is going on the triangle label underneath your plastic packaging. But right now, it's unheard of anymore. So the reason why it's getting cheaper, it's getting there's more plastic packaging waste, food packaging waste. It's because they're using more additives. They're actually diluting all this pure plastics. Like what Dow is doing, it's responsible production. But there's a lot of companies out there, especially in developing countries, with no regulations on how to produce plastic in the right way. Mm-hmm. They're having this war price on producing plastic, and it's not helpful to anyone because plastics is a transboundary issue. Mm-hmm. And just because you can't do it in the developed countries, like what you said recently as well, they'll bring it to another country that has a loophole on that. So I think.
So you're pushing the problem elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. Cheryl, can I come back to you in the sort of closing minutes that we have and just think about the alignment of the desire that we've heard from you for greater sustainability, a reduction of waste, a more circular economy, and how does that align with your commercial imperative? So obviously, if you're producing plastic feedstock, you have a desire to sell more of it. But how do you align that objective with the desire for sustainability?
So I'll speak about our close the loop goal. I mean, by 2035, we would like to have 100% of the plastics that we sell into the market either reusable or recyclable. So it's within our framework of what we want to do and what we want to achieve. So yes, we know that plastics has its place, but it has to be a new way of doing business, a new way of thinking about plastics.
Right. Okay. Josh, do you buy that? Can plastics can the commercial model of selling plastic be reinvented to be sustainable?
Well, yes and no. First of all, I think what I would say is that it's really a quick maths, right? It's how many bottles, packets, sachets, whatever that you put out versus how much you can actually account for that you've actually taken out. So even if and this is a challenge to you, like even if by 2035 you say, okay, everything that goes out is reusable and recyclable, is there a mechanism for you to really account that whatever you put out has been gotten out of the environment and not sit on a landfill somewhere? And I think that greater responsibility has been left out because, everyone can make a promise and can pledge, now we pledges as the new thing, net zero this, net zero that. The accountability mechanisms are so weak. So it's easy to pledge and to work towards something and never getting there. So you pledge towards something, but there's no way to actually account to say that you actually got there. So that's the first thing I'm very concerned about with all the pledges and all the things that we hope to achieve, that what is the accountability mechanism? And we shouldn't necessarily think that we can rely on government solely for that. Governments have a role to play.
Does that come from the community level?
No. Private sector again. Governments have a role to play. I will not put so much responsibility on consumers. I work with consumers, I work with communities. Options are very limited. You do what you do to survive. Simple as that. But government can put a certain level of regulation, but they will not go beyond a point where they're going to cause chaos within their own economy. So there's a limit to that, in addition to the lobbying that comes from private sector. When private sector internally have the right mechanism to make sure that, okay, we're putting out 10,000 bottles of whatever product out there. Internally, we've set up a mechanism. We are supporting the informal waste workers. We're supporting those recyclers. We're supporting those informal collectors. We're supporting all the different stakeholders involved in the process. Then, yes, I will believe that you can put out 10,000 bottles of plastics and you can get it back.
And what do you think is the policing mechanism for that?
I think the policing mechanism for that is, government should go to the highest extent of what they can do, but then we need really private sector to also meet it on that front. Because I think right now it's such a battle between, and I've seen this in many sub-Saharan African countries, it's not like they don't hear the problem from most young people complaining about plastics, but they are very tight on how far can we go without causing disruption within our own economy. And I said it in an informal conversation. If you start selling products in those big packages like in the US, in sub-Saharan Africa, people cannot afford it. You need to sell them in these small packets, and most of these packaging are plastics. But that's what people can afford. So from a policymaker's perspective, you're also thinking, okay, I can go hard on this, but how do I make sure that people can still live and survive? And I think from that side, private sector could come in to say, okay, we're going to invest most of our resources into new packaging technologies that allow us to still sell in mini packets, right, but not plastic waste. And I've not seen that, frankly. I've not seen most of your colleagues and other companies doing the most on that. The effort on the private sector is zero. I mean, I would say they've not done, not what is even the minimum from my perspective to really tackle the plastic problem. It's a huge problem. It's a global problem. And the thing is, you keep moving from one place to the other. So they try something here, they sell it over there. So, I mean, company A will say, in Latin America, we started supporting recyclers. We've set up recycling initiatives. Well, does that equate to the number of products you actually put on the market in that country? No. And then the last point is to stress on what Steve said, the finance. Plastic is just way too cheap and way too convenient. which is a problem. Because then you don't leave people living a choice. It's just way too cheap, way too convenient, because most of the cost is not accounted for. So could we have a system where all the costs are accounted for? I mean, policy can do part of that, but where we have a very realistic cost, which makes it a little bit not just too convenient as it is now. Because sometimes I talk to people and I have colleagues who, no, they want to be champions of this. But again, in Nigeria, in Ghana, the easiest way to get water is from this water pouch. It's like, they don't want to, but even if you carry a water bottle, believe me, at some point you still buy from the water pouch in the plastic and put it in your reusable water bottle, because it's just too convenient.
It might be that plastic isn't quite the enemy here, but maybe a sort of imperfect solution to two different problems we've talked about, right? So one of them is the problem of like rapid urbanization without the infrastructure to match. And the other is the problem of a lack of capacity in government to keep up with the waste problem. And I like your optimism that we can look to the private sector for change. I worry that it won't happen without sufficient public pressure.
That's why the treaty is there. That's why the treaty is there to drive us towards that point.
But I'm not sure if it works if Coca-Cola is sponsoring this COP itself, because it's such a huge, in the face, because just 8 months ago, we were working so hard to actually get this mandate going. And it's actually one of the first plastic mandate for an international legally binding plastic treaty. And for COP to be sponsored by Coca-Cola itself, it's like, it's fine. We don't need you guys. Like, we can. But one of the things that just one last thing. It's how corporates are always pushing the responsibility of recycling to consumers in a way. They would tell us that this is 100% recyclable. This is 100% recyclable. We've done this with this and that. And I've been through all countries, and I can tell you that I've seen Coca-Cola bottles in every single country on the floor with a huge "this is recyclable" label.
Right.
So,
but not being recycled.
Exactly.
Well, who should recycle it? If you don't you put it there, and then you say this is recyclable. To who? And who should do it?
Great. Thank you all very much for your contribution today. Thank you very much for your attention in the room and online. I think we've had an amazing tour of the problem. I'm afraid we haven't quite come up with a solution in 45 minutes. Please join us again at 10 a.m. Egyptian time, 8 a.m. GMT tomorrow, when we'll be talking about solutions to some of the policy solutions to some of the major climate challenges that are facing countries in the developing world. Thank you very much.